mom. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The plains north of Fort Bridger carried a late-season chill that settled into clothing and stiffened hands even before the sun dropped. Elias Rourke guided his wagon along the dirt track at a steady pace, observing the faint frost forming in shaded patches near the brush line. His daughters sat close together on the seat, wrapped in thick blankets. June kept her chin tucked into the fabric, while Hannah watched the lanterns of the traveling supply caravan ahead with quiet interest. Elias had been a widower for 3 years. Since the day his wife died in childbirth, his life had become a narrow path built on responsibility. He woke early, checked fences, fed cattle, prepared meals, and kept his daughters safe. He avoided unnecessary talk, avoided town gatherings, avoided anything that distracted from the work of keeping his small ranch alive. He had served as an Army scout long before becoming a family man. And although he left that life behind after refusing an order that weighed on him still, the habits of caution stayed with him. He arrived at the caravan just as the traders were finishing their final transactions. Lanterns hung from wagon frames, casting unsteady light across crates of tools, sacks of beans, folded blankets, and coiled rope. A few men shouted prices while others hammered shut lids or tied down loads. Horses shifted on the far end, their hooves pressing into cold dirt. Elias stepped down from the wagon slowly, feeling the tightness in his back from the week's labor. He unloaded the grain he intended to trade and carried it toward the caravan leader, who counted the sacks with a quick nod. Elias turned toward a row of tools laid out for inspection. He selected a hinge, tested it with his thumb, and weighed whether it would stand up against the wind that often battered his barn door. His mind moved ahead to the chores waiting at home. Splitting more wood, repairing June's coat sleeve, checking the stovepipe before snow settled for good. He was focused on these tasks when he heard a strained breath from somewhere behind the tool crates. It wasn't loud, but it carried a kind of tension that made him look up. June heard it too and shifted her stance, leaning slightly forward. Hannah's small hand tightened around her sister's wrist. Elias lifted his eyes toward the source of the sound. Near the back of the caravan, a young Apache woman stood beside 2 tired horses. The rope around her wrist was tied loose, but it was still rope. Her dress was torn across one shoulder. Dirt marked her forearms and the edges of her clothing. Beadwork hung unevenly on the damaged fabric. Her posture showed exhaustion, legs braced just enough to stay upright, arms held close, breathing shallow. She watched the ground but kept track of movement around her with small, precise shifts of her eyes. A caravan handler pushed a crate aside without looking behind him. The sudden motion forced her to step back quickly, which she did without complaint, though her shoulders tightened as if expecting a strike. June whispered, "She's scared." Hannah pressed closer to Elias's coat. She didn't speak, but the worry in her eyes was clear. Elias observed the woman carefully. She showed no signs of aggression or resistance. She looked like someone who had traveled too far without rest, someone who had reached the limit of what her body could endure. He turned back to the tools, telling himself he had no reason to get involved. He needed stability for his daughters. Bringing in a stranger, especially one who had been passed through caravans, was not part of his plan. The caravan leader walked over, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "You brought good grain, Rourke. Pick whatever you want in return." Elias gestured toward the box of hinges and nails. "These will work." The man nodded, ready to finalize the deal, but the girls' voices stopped the moment. Hannah whispered, "She looks cold." June added, steadier, We want her. We want that woman as our mom." Elias felt a sharp pull in his chest. He turned to his daughters first. Their expressions were open, serious, and afraid for the woman. Then he looked back at her. She had not heard the girls, but she stood with the same drawn posture, hands trembling lightly at her sides, face showing the strain of trying to remain upright. He looked at the caravan leader. "Why is she tied?" "Picked her up after a raid in the foothills," the man said, shrugging as if none of it mattered. "Camp burned. Survivors scattered. She was alone. We don't have time for trouble. If you want her, take her." saves us hauling her to the next stop. Elias disliked the casual tone. He disliked the implication that she was an object rather than a person. Most of all, he disliked the faint memory it stirred. Another woman he once failed to help during his army days, a moment he had never spoken about to anyone. He stepped around the crates and approached the woman slowly, making sure she could see his hands. She didn't back away. She didn't lift her chin. She just watched him with a tired, guarded expression. He drew a small knife from his belt and said quietly, "I'm cutting the rope. You're safe." He placed the blade carefully against the cord and sliced through it. The rope fell to the ground. She didn't rub her wrists. She simply lowered her hands, unsure of what came next. Her breathing changed slightly, not easier yet, but no longer held tight. Elias lifted his chin toward the wagon. "Come with us. You won't be hurt." Her eyes met his for the first time. He saw fear mixed with uncertainty, but also something else, an awareness that she no longer had the strength to walk anywhere on her own. She stepped toward the wagon slowly, using the side rail for balance as she climbed up. June moved aside immediately. Hannah offered a blanket with both hands. The woman accepted it without lifting her gaze, pulling it tightly around her shoulders. Elias returned to the driver's seat, took a steady breath, and snapped the reins gently. The horses began pulling the wagon away from the caravan. The night air grew colder as they traveled, the sound of the wheels blending with the distant cry of a coyote. No one spoke. The only movement came from the woman adjusting the blanket and the girls watching her with quiet concern. Elias kept his eyes on the road, mind turning through the consequences of what he had just done. He didn't regret it, but he understood the weight of it. He had brought a stranger into his home, a woman whose past he didn't yet know, a woman who had already endured more than most men could survive. His daughters had acted out of instinct, not understanding the complexities he now had to navigate. But as the plains stretched ahead and the lights of the caravan disappeared behind them, Elias accepted the simple truth settling inside him. Leaving her, there had never been an option he could live with. The wagon reached the Rourke homestead long after the last daylight faded. The cabin's outline appeared first as a dark shape against the wide plains, then sharpened as the horses approached the corral. A single lantern burned near the porch, its light steady in the still air. Elias pulled the reins gently, bringing the team to a halt. The girls climbed down with practiced care, their boots hitting the ground softly. The Apache woman remained seated for a moment, examining the cabin with guarded caution, unsure how to enter a place that was not hers. Elias stepped to her side. "You can come inside. It's warmer there." His voice remained calm, without pressure. She reacted with a small nod, then stood carefully, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders before stepping down from the wagon. Her movements were slow, not due to reluctance, but fatigue so deep that even standing required concentration. Inside the cabin, warmth spread from the iron stove. June lit an extra lantern, placing it on the table. Hannah moved blankets from a chair to make space. The interior was tidy, two small beds pushed against the far wall, Elias's cot near the stove, shelves lined with jars, tools stacked under the window. Life here was simple, efficient, and built on routines that left no time for clutter. The woman hesitated at the doorway. The scent of wood smoke and cooked beans filled the air, a smell she recognized but had not felt safe around in weeks. Elias noticed her uncertainty and stepped aside so she would not feel cornered. She entered slowly, taking in every detail, weighing whether the quiet inside was genuine or temporary. Elias set a pot on the stove. "There's food left from earlier. It's not much, but it's warm." She didn't answer, though her eyes followed the steam rising from the pot. Hunger pulled at her, but she waited, unsure if she had permission to approach the table. Hannah placed a tin cup on the bench and filled it with water. She looked at the woman without fear. "You can drink. It's clean." The woman accepted the cup carefully, her fingers shaking as she lifted it. The first sip steadied her breathing. The second eased the tension in her shoulders. June sat on the edge of her bed, watching closely, trying to understand how someone could look so strong and so unsteady at the same time. She spoke quietly, as though raising her voice might startle their guest. "What's your name?" The woman lowered the cup, hesitating before answering. "Naya." Her voice was low, roughened from days of silence. Elias stirred the pot, listening. He didn't turn, not wanting her to feel scrutinized. He served her a small bowl of beans and set on the table without pushing it toward her. She stepped forward only when she felt certain no one expected anything from her except to eat. While she ate, Elias finally allowed himself to study her more closely. Her face held bruises that were fading but still visible. Her arms showed the thin marks of rope that had been tied too often in recent days. She sat straight, even when exhausted, as though lowering her posture would be a sign of weakness she couldn't afford. He asked nothing. Not yet. He didn't want to force her to relive anything on the first night. The girls eventually settled into their beds. Hannah kept watching Naya with half-closed eyes, as though afraid she might disappear if she looked away. June whispered something to her sister, then pulled the blankets up to her chin. Elias stood by the stove, rubbing warmth into his hands. He glanced at Naya's thin clothing, at the torn fabric near her shoulder, at the way she kept her feet close together for warmth. He opened a chest near his cot and took out a folded wool shawl. "You can use this tonight," he said, placing it on the corner of the table. "The nights get colder out here." She stared at the shawl for a moment, unsure whether accepting it meant some obligation she didn't understand. When she finally reached for it, her movements were slow, as if testing whether the offer would be withdrawn. "You'll sleep there." Elias pointed to the far corner of the cabin, where he had placed a spare blanket on the floor earlier. "It's not much, but it's safe." The word safe made something shift in her expression. Not relief, but a small release in the lines around her mouth. A visible acknowledgement that she understood the difference between temporary shelter and genuine refuge. Naya sat on the blanket, adjusting her borrowed shawl. She scanned the cabin a final time, checking door, window, stove, distance to the girls, as if creating a map she needed for rest. Elias poured himself a small amount of water and stood in the quiet room, aware of her presence in a way he hadn't expected. Her silence didn't press into the space. It settled, cautious and uncertain, but without threat. He spoke once more before putting out the lantern. "No one here will ever hurt you. That's the only rule this home has." She lifted her eyes. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. But the tension in her posture eased a fraction, enough to show she had heard him clearly. When the lantern went dark, the room filled with the soft breathing of 2 children and the crackling of the stove. Naya lay awake a long time, listening for danger out of habit. Elias lay awake too, listening to her adjust her blanket and settle into a space she hadn't asked for but needed. Neither of them spoke again, but the uneasy silence slowly changed shape, something no longer built on fear, but on the first thin layer of trust forming between strangers who needed more from each other than they knew how to say. A pale strip of light appeared along the eastern horizon before anyone spoke. The stove had burned low during the night, leaving a faint warmth that clung to the cabin's wood walls. Elias rose first, careful not to wake the girls. He moved with practiced quiet, pulling on his boots, adjusting his coat, and checking the firebox to judge how much kindling he needed. The air inside the cabin held the cold of early dawn, enough to make his breath show when he leaned forward. Naya stirred in the corner, lifting her head slightly, but not sitting up. She looked around with the alertness of someone who had spent many nights in unsafe places and did not yet trust morning light. Her blanket had slipped halfway down, and she pulled it back around her shoulders without meeting Elias's eyes. He nodded once, acknowledging her presence without forcing conversation. He opened the door and stepped outside. Frost covered the ground in a thin layer that cracked softly beneath his boots. The horses stood near the fence, breath rising in slow clouds. He crossed the yard to the pump, working the handle until cold water splashed against the metal bucket. The temperature stung his hands, but he kept moving, knowing the animals needed water before the sun warmed the day. By the time he stepped back inside, June was awake, hair messy, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She rubbed her eyes and looked toward Naya before saying anything. "Did you sleep?" June asked quietly. Naya paused. Enough. Her answer was short but genuine, surprising even to her. It had been the first night in weeks where she hadn't been tied, shoved, or forced to flee. Hannah woke next, tucking her feet beneath her body as she sat up. She scanned the room, saw Naya still there, and relaxed. Hannah's relief carried a softness that didn't need words. She simply rose and moved to help her father without hesitation. Elias set the pot on the stove and poured in water. The crackle of kindling replaced silence as he worked. Naya watched him, not out of suspicion, but out of a need to understand the rhythms of this place. She didn't know what was expected